Hi, my name is Addie. I am in a group with Levi and Nick. We chose to do our presentation on the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. If you're not familiar with this act comes after the 60s, with everything kind of starts to be a big boom. This is where marijuana blows up, this is where heroin blows up, this is where cocaine blows up. It's just this emergence of drugs, and it also is shortly after the civil rights movement, and I'll get into that later, but keep that in mind. So the act aims to protect public safety, create a closed distribution system for those authorized to handle controlled substances, and classify drugs according to the substance's medical use, potential for abuse, and dependence liability. So using those factors, the act created 3 titles to determine a drug's classification. So Title 1 deals with the establishment of rehabilitation programs for drug abusers. Title 2 addresses the registration and distribution of controlled substances, and Title 3 discusses issues related to the importance and exportation of controlled substances. So that's a big fancy way of saying how drugs are maintained, what we do with drug users, drug dealers, drug abusers, and how we register and how can we distribute these drugs. And then there are also 5 schedules of drugs, and those are based on the potential of abuse. So schedule number 1 is the highest potential for abuse, and then schedule 5 is lowest potential for abuse. And they have kind of like followed those rules up until today. And the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, was kind of created to help boost those factors and enforce these things. A little background, President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law on October 27th, 1970. The United States Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act in response to America's growing drug problem. Many actors were involved on either side of the argument, including the legislative branch, the executive branch, drug reform activists, and grassroots communities. So at the legislative branch, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. They were involved in that legal side. Executive branch, through the use of the DEA, enforcement of these policies were possible, so they were able to enforce the Controlled Substances Act through the use of the DEA. And then drug reform activists help reform drug reform going forward. So they kind of helped continue to shape and make better ideas for the future. And then grassroots communities are obviously communities that wanted to come in and be like, hey, this is impacting our community. What can we do to figure it out? And that's what they did. So another major part of the Controlled Substances Act was the involvement in discrimination. It definitely impacted communities because it impacted lower income and minority communities. I like to call it discrimination without being discrimination. There was a book that I found in my research that basically called the Controlled Substances Act the New Jim Crow Laws, which, if you don't know what the Jim Crow laws are, were the laws of segregation after slaves were emancipated that allowed people to still discriminate without saying that they're discriminating them. Um, 38% of federal drug offenders are African Americans, and 37% are Latinos, despite their smaller percentage in the population. Um, the policies also led to an increased police brutality. Leading into my next point, the AIDS epidemic was not good because of drug use. Um, it drug addiction made AIDS worse. It impacted the brain. It caused people to get it more quickly because when you're high and you're stoned, it increases your chances to do risky stuff, including sex with risky people. And if you're a gay man, you're more likely to get HIV and AIDS. So it was really interesting to see how like the AIDS epidemic was impacted this, and then therefore impacted the LGBTQ community.
Hello, I'm Levi Workman, and I will be analyzing the power dynamics between social actors. To start off here, we have two big theories that we go over: conflict theory versus structural functionalism, and how they go hand in hand with this particular issue. To start off with the conflict theory, what is conflict theory? We know this. It's a state of perpetual conflict over limited resources. The CSA, according to a conflict theorist, would be seen as a tool used by the political and economic elites to maintain their power and control. Drug enforcement policies influenced by the CSA are seen as reinforcing the existing hierarchy, and therefore the same repression enforcement practices may disproportionately target marginalized communities, perpetuating these cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. Conflict theorists also argue that the CSA's enforcement reflects the interests of powerful groups rather than addressing the root cause of these drug abuses. The USA is by far the most incarcerated country, especially in the first world. I was recently watching the movie 13th. I don't know if you've all seen it, but it's really good, and it goes over really marginalized communities in the prison system and economic system all throughout the United States here. According to the documentary here, there were 2.3 million inmates in the United States in 2014. That is up 357,000 from 1970. They say things like, although they make up 6.6% of the total population in the United States, 40.2% of inmates are black men. So communities are, stripped of that. Conflict theorists, again, contend that the elites, particularly those in positions of political power, economic influence drug laws to suit their own agendas. Some believe that the CSA represents the interests of the political elite rather than addressing the underlying causes of drug consumption because of its emphasis on criminalization and punitive measures. This feeds into the power imbalances in this economic system here that the CSA has created. Power struggles and imbalances between various social groups are highlighted by the conflict theory here, especially in the tradition of theorists such as Karl Marx, who tagged the idea here. The way drug laws are disproportionately impacting marginalized populations within the framework of the CSA is a clear example of these power disparities. Due to the political and economic elites, law enforcement agencies frequently, again, target these groups. All right, so the other theory that feeds into the CSA Act of 1970 is structural functionalism, which is society's categorization of its people into rankings based off of factors like wealth, income, power, education, family, etc. It is a foundation for developing theory that views society as an intricate system whose components cooperate to uphold stability and solidarity. The structural functionalist would see this issue. The CSA is perceived as a mechanism to maintain social order in regulating drug-related behavior. Also, drug laws are designed to deter substance abuse and promote adherence to societal norms, which sound like a good thing, but they can get quite authoritarian, as we have seen. Societal stratification also exists within this broad stroke. Societal stratification refers to a society's categorization of its people into rankings based off of factors. Again, like this, people convicted under drug laws, especially those pertaining to the CSA, frequently encounter difficulties finding work even after they've served their time. Drug-related felonies that result in criminal records narrow economic possibilities and exacerbate social stratification, even furthering the divide between classes. Due to the disproportionate impact that drug prohibitions have had on economically disadvantaged populations, they have the potential to prolong wealth inequality. Economic imbalances are made worse by underprivileged groups' limited access to these legal resources that, if they wanted to take recourse against, they just have no access to. Racial and ethnic minorities have been disproportionately targeted by the CSA's enforcement. Again, just restating that fact, which has drawn a ton of criticism.
My name is Dominic Lugonis. I'm here to talk about what factors were in place that caused our policy to come to be, as well as what effects this policy had in the long run. So at the time, there's a lot of law and order policies being in place as there was a rise in crime at the time. So a lot of politicians and citizens saw a need to create stricter law enforcement policies to mitigate that as much as possible. Um, Ultimately, resulting in the political strategy of the war on drugs, directly resulting into the CSA and other drug-related laws being strengthened. At the time, there was also still a lot of racial and socioeconomic disparities, and the application of drug laws were influenced by social variables such as past instances of institutional racism, which could have a disproportionate effect on underprivileged communities. Uh, Law enforcement's targeting strategies and the way drug policies are put into practice can be influenced by the social uh, milieu in which drug usage takes place. Media representation also took a lot of part in the creation of this, as cultural depictions of drug use in news articles, television shows, and other media sources, sensationalized depictions of drug-related problems have the potential to provoke issues within the community, as well as cause a moral panic within the public eye. Um, Cultural values and traditions also had a part to play, as um, how drugs are regulated might be influenced uh, by how people have previously perceived drugs with religion as well, and seeing how it's a mind-altering substance, it can vary on how people would perceive it as problematic or potentially against their religion. So to get in, now coming from uh, these past reasons why it came to be, it's important to recognize that what the impact of these reasons to make it has caused. So one thing is there are a lot of racial and socioeconomic disparities. And to quote the National Institute, um, in 2013, among persons aged 12 or older, the rate of current illicit drug use was 3.1% among Asians, 8.8% among Hispanics, 9.5% among whites, 10.5% among blacks, 12.3% among American Indians or Alaska Natives, and then 14% among Native Hawaiians or other islanders. So they're all relatively within a percentage of each other. Of course, those who are American Indians tend to have higher issues with drug abuse, and then Asians tend to have really low issues with drug abuse. But for the most part, all races tend to use it about the same within the US. However, African Americans, even though they comprise only 13% of the population and they use drugs only about 2% more than on average than whites, they occupy 30% of those arrested for drug law violations. Greatly disproportionate percentage of their race within the U.S. are jailed, even though there isn't a disproportionate use of overall drugs. There are similar issues as well shown with the Latino population. Luckily, the gap is narrowing of African American rates and white rates that are subject to minimum sentencing, but is still rather significant and can still be a major issue. Mass incarceration is another big impact that was caused from all of this, as the U.S. spends over $80 billion on prisons and jails due to taking care of all of these minimum sentencing that's required due to the CSA. With 1.5 million drug arrests in the U.S. in 2013, and more than 80% were possession only, directly relating to its being a minimum sentencing issue. The United States is less than 5% of the world's population, but we maintain 25% of the incarcerated population for the world. Mandatory minimum sentencing continues to impact issues of mass incarceration. Half of the federal prison is due to drug offenses, and 3/4 of those are from mandatory minimum sentencing. 50% of those convicted of a drug offense had little or no prior history. Many of those who are sentenced to mandatory minimum sentencing are less likely to partake in drugs again, which is the only silver lining in this but that is very likely due to they entered at a younger population and now they're leaving as an older population, and as the national survey shows, younger populations tend to be more likely to use drugs anyways. The U.S. Sentencing Commission has stated themselves, reporting that Congress did not anticipate how badly minimum penalties applied, showing that the impact of the CSA has been largely negative and caused a lot of issues and strain on the American people.